And then now I have to do the hard work, but it's good hard work of being like, wait a second, like, where am I? Where are my blind spots? Where am I cultish? If we want to look at being cultic or cultish in that way, where am I blindly following something? Where am I, driven by a kind of a fanaticism? Where am I practicing a sort of literalism to the point of being harmful?
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Free Radical Podcast. Today I had the fortune of talking with a dear brother, scholar, and podcast host, Venkata Bhatta. Venkata Bhatta grew up in New York City and embraced the path of Krishna-bhakti in his youth. A long-time student of His Holiness Radhanath Swami, he is known for blending ancient wisdom with practical, relatable insights. Venkata has talked widely at temples, ashrams, yoga studios, and online platforms like Embodied Philosophy, where he offers courses on the Bhagavad Gita and Upanishads. He also serves as Assistant Dean of Religious Life and Hindu Chaplain at Princeton University, co-hosts the Namarasa Podcast, and is co-author of 2 academic volumes on Hinduism and spiritual care. He holds advanced degrees in law, religion, and education. So today, podcast explore a rich, wide tapestry of topics with, of course, Venkata's personal journey, the daily commitment that it entails to embrace a spiritual path like Gaudiya Vaishnavism on a daily basis. Then we started to explore the global relevance of our particular traditions and what is keeping it from becoming as relevant as it could be, how to make it more accessible, relevant, relatable. And then we concentrated on sensitive topics like cultic behaviors in our own tradition, in other traditions, in spiritual spaces in general. And we also went through deep reflections on grief and loss, important topics that we also need to deal with in our community, disillusionment and spiritual path, and caregiving ministry, navigating institutional challenges, and a whole host of very interesting topics. So please join us in this conversation. This is the Free Radical Podcast. And to support it, please subscribe to the channel by clicking on the bell. And if you feel inspired and nourished, you can share it, you can like it, you can share your comments with us so we can keep this ongoing conversation as it is ongoing. So without further ado, dear friends, brothers, sisters, family, here is Venkata Bhatta. Welcome, Venkata Bhatta ji. Thanks so much for joining
Thank you,
us on the Free
Maharaj.
Radical Podcast.
Hare Krishna. It's wonderful to be here.
My pleasure. How does it feel to be on the other side of the podcast and not being co-host anymore?
Yeah, not gonna lie, it's definitely a different experience. I feel a little bit. I think my empathy quotient is going to grow from this because I'm going to get to feel what it's like to be in the hot seat a little bit, and it's not an easy thing. So hopefully my appreciation for guests that I get to interview will grow as a result of it. But also on a more serious note, super grateful to be having this conversation with you. And I like hanging out with you and chatting. And so I'm just kind of approaching it in that way.
Yeah. Our first 3D meeting was when we did the last podcast with you and Namarasa, right? That was the very first, I mean, a few days before that, but that was the first time we met in person.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that was the first time we met in person. And then the last time we met in person was just recently in Vrindavan.
Yeah, Radha Kunda Govardhan Parikram. Unforgettable.
That's right. And you introduced me to this nice little cafe in Radhakund.
That was a highlight for you, okay?
It was one of the highlights. I mean, I'm betraying where my consciousness is, but that Pali was kind of hard to forget.
Yeah. Here we are. So, Venkataji, I was, before starting this conversation, of course, I share a few words about your life. So a little bit introduction of you for the audience. You have been growing up, if I'm not mistaken, in New York City, and eventually serving as a Hindu chaplain at Princeton University, and co-hosting the Namarasa Podcast as the icing on the cake. So, and in the midst of this, all of this, of course, you became a Gaudiya Vaishnav. So I'm curious about what made you choose this tradition, so to say, in particular, and continue to choose Gaudiya Vaishnavism on a daily basis, if we can kickstart there.
Yeah. First of all, so gosh, I'm just I have so much appreciation for the way that you frame things and articulate things, and that's just a prime example. This to look at the idea of continuing to choose rather than just a one and done choice. So I just want to say, like, yeah, I super appreciate that approach. I also want to say, before I kind of dive in, that it's funny when I feel like the experience, and maybe Maharaj, you can relate to this, but being introduced somewhere is always so interesting because you hear all these different aspects of your identity, or even different identities, if we look at them as separate things. And I'm just, for practical reasons, I'm often asked to send in a bio if I'm speaking somewhere, and I try to modify whatever existing little write-up I have, just from these speaking opportunities. I try to modify them to particular audiences, but still there's just all these like interesting disparate parts and threads. And the newest addition, I think, to the bio for me is co-host with Namarasa of the podcast, which to me, in my mind, is, and I don't mean this in any way to like put down or diminish the impact of the podcast, right? But to me, that's just like a fun thing that I do because I enjoy it, because I like spending time with Namarasa, because I like the fact that he and I can disagree on certain things, agree on other things, but just have like a really kind of loving rapport. So to me, that's like my fun. That's like my like my kind of like fun little hobby side thing. But and it happened again this last time I was in India, including in Bruj. It's like almost kind of humbling, because in many spaces that somehow has become like the primary identity. So I'm now like stopped by some people and they go, "Oh, Prabhu, you are the co-host of the Namra." And it's sort of like, it's like, oh, like 40 years of doing like all this other stuff is like taking a backseat now to like this wonderful, fun podcast that I co-host some of the time. So I just think that's kind of funny.
Everyone
anyway,
everyone in the Gaudiya community seems to have as their primary designation some connection with the Namarasa podcast, probably, because not only you as a co-host, but me myself, like, oh Maharaj, I knew you from the Namarasa podcast. So that happens to be.
Oh, have you gotten that too?
Oh yeah, a lot, yeah. Oh yeah, I knew about you.
Okay.
I mean, I'm grateful and I appreciate Namarasa for opening that door to others, but it seems that the first upadi or designation is like something somehow connected to the Namarasa podcast, so which speaks about its interesting impact on many. So, and I appreciate your role there, as we were talking. I remember I think in Govardhan Radhakundan that day, and the dynamics between you and Namarasa, and the diversity and the differences of opinion, and how actually that's enriching not only to the conversations you're having, but even to your relationship between yourself and to getting to know each other through diversity. So
Oh yeah, well, yeah, thank you for that. I also feel better because if I know it's not just me, like you also get the Namarasa, somehow you are connected to Namarasa podcast Upadi thing. You get that. Yeah,
we are all branded. We are all branded. It's a brand, and we are branded with the brand.
Do you know this actor Kevin Bacon? Does that name mean anything to you, or no? It wasn't. You grew up in Argentina, yes?
Yeah.
So I guess Kevin Bacon wasn't big in Argentina when you were growing up. But when I was growing up, so Kevin Bacon's just this actor, and he was quite popular, at least when I was growing up, in sort of like the 1980s and 90s in America. And I don't know where it started, but there was this game that got started, kind of like a fun little party game or something, called 6 Degrees of Separation from Kevin Bacon. And it was like you had the challenge was to tie any famous person back to this actor in like 6 degrees of separation or less. And I feel like now it's become, within our Gaudiya world, it's become 6 degrees of separation from Namarasa, and it's much less than 6. You could usually do it in like 3 or something,
Yeah.
Anyway, here we are. So,
our initial praise and homily to Namarasa before starting. That's our Mangala.
That's kind of like
Namarasa Podcast.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. That's our Mangala Charan.
We have to in our conversation.
Well, he is the king of all podcasts or something, right? So we have to bow down. On a serious tip.
So what made you
my
choose this tradition and continue to choose this tradition on a daily basis, Venkataji?
Yeah.
And I appreciate that you appreciated the point of continue to choose, because I don't think it's my own creation. It's just a daily fact to make it realistic and sustainable. It's not just I was initiated one day and I'm already initiated. I no longer need to go deeper into what initiation means. I surrender one day. I can no longer become more initiated. No, it's a daily process, right? I accepted sannyas one day 15 years ago, but I have to renew my vows on the day to day and make them deeper and ever fresh. So the same applies to this. I became a Gaudiya Vaishnava, but do I continue remaining Gaudiya Vaishnava for the right reasons? Because we can continue affiliated with some particular school for the wrong reasons as well, right? But I don't want to go that far now. Please share your own thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I want to, gosh, there's so much good stuff. I want to bracket that and come back to it, especially the point that you just made about initiation specifically, because I think at least it's something that I've experienced and I'd like to share about. And I imagine others also experience from time to time. I hear these stories of the way that we think about initiation, the self-talk around initiation, the social pressure around initiation or initiations of various, types within our traditions. But anyway, going back to, my choosing, I guess if I can reel it a little bit back. So as you said, in your introduction, I grew up, I was born and raised in the US, in New York specifically, so in a very cosmopolitan kind of setting. Very aware from a very early age of being the child of immigrants. And that's something that I think it's a sort of a theme that has in one way, shape, or form continued throughout my life. And I continue to talk about the idea of kind of hybrid identities.
When you say very aware, you mean how much the environment, so to say, was reminding you of that, not in the most positive way, basically?
Both. I think the environment was definitely reminding me. I think there was something from within also. I've in other contexts, I've spoken about this a little bit where from some of my earliest memories, I just had this real sense of, wow, I am somehow a part of at least two different worlds that in some ways, superficially at least, are very different from each other, maybe even at odds with each other. And also from a pretty young age, this realization that like somehow I can never fully inhabit either one. And that I will never fully be accepted into either one. And when you talk about external environments, definitely, even in a place like New York, which was quite, diverse compared to other parts of the country, right? This wasn't, the situation where I'm in the middle of America and, mine is the only non-white family or something. Even in that very diverse context, still just a lot of reminders that like, wow, like I am seen as, although I was, American born and, I certainly felt American in many ways, whatever that means. But just this awareness that, wow, I'm being seen as a foreigner. I'm being seen as an other. I'm being seen as something different, something exotic, something outside of the mainstream. And then the flip side of that is also being in very Indian spaces, including sometimes in my own home or with my parents or with extended family, and constantly being sort of reminded or reflected back to me that like, oh, I'm not quite Indian enough, right? I'm a product of and somehow inextricably tied to this being American or even like kind of being white or whitewashed. And I'm making it sound maybe more negative than it always was. It wasn't always negative, but it was challenging.
Which is not to keep it on the negative note, but what do you think was the main gifts that you received from being a a child of the liminal space, so to say, not being fully here nor there. What do you think was the gift that has given you as a person, as an individual?
Yeah, I mean, I think now looking at it from the vantage point of today, I mean, so many gifts, right? It just a fluidity and ability to flow in and out of spaces without being beholden or entirely defined by them. I think I now see as much more of a strength. The ability to, I think, critically reflect on different spaces, different identities in a way that might not happen if I were like solely tied to one. I certainly see that as a strength. I mean, in some ways, right, the liminal space or the hybrid space is one that sort of allows for creativity and allows for possibilities, in a way. And I think, not that I'm the most creative person in the world, but I feel like whatever creativity I am able to tap into, a lot of it does have to do with this comfort with liminality, this comfort with, not being bound in by preconceived categories and labels and notions and things like that. Again, not to go back too much on the negative, but I think I've come to appreciate that with time and hopefully a little bit of maturity, but it also can be a very, very lonely space. And occasionally I still do feel that sort of existential loneliness, right? Because it's that feeling of like neither here nor there, a little bit of a kind of a homelessness. Again, speaking metaphorically, there's an Indian idiomatic expression that I often refer to, but it's hard to, it loses something in translation. So I'm never able to clearly articulate it in English, but I'll still try. It's this story. It's a little kind of parable of the washerman's dog. So the story goes, you've seen in India, you've spent a good amount of time in India, the ghats, right? The banks of a body of water where the washerman washes clothes.
Yes.
That's called the dhobi ghat, right? The washerman's a dhobi. So those dhobi ghats, they tend to be a place, ghats in general, for reasons that maybe a veterinarian can explain or something, but they tend to attract a lot of stray dogs. I think when we were at Radhakund and Shamakund, we were hanging out with some of the, Vrajvasis in the form of stray dogs.
Four-legged Dambasis,
The four-legged Dambasis, that's right. So, that's just a very common fixture in India. You see it a lot. And so there's a story of a dog that is there at the ghat, and this one dhobi kind of takes a liking to him, and so the dog becomes friendly with the washerman, and he actually goes home with the washerman. He follows the washerman home, and when he comes to the washerman's house, the washerman's wife basically kicks him out and says, like, no, you're a stray dog. Like, get out of here, right? This is not your home. And so he goes back, perhaps a little dejected, we might imagine. He goes back to the ghat. But the interesting thing is, the other dogs at the ghat, they also reject him. And they say, well, you're not one of us. You're domesticated now. Get out of here. Right? And so the expression in Hindi, which I don't remember where I first heard it, but I must have heard this even as a child or a youth. The expression goes, dhobi ka kutta, na ghat ka, na ghar ka, which means the washerman's dog neither belongs to the home nor outside of it, nor to the ghat, right? They're lost in this no man's land, right? I just felt like that was, I'm even getting kind of like goosebumps just thinking about it. Like, I remember when I heard that, just the sense of like familiarity that it had for me, like, oh wow, I get that feeling on a deep level. In a way, in a sense, I bring that up and I often situate myself there and contextualize that, because I feel like it was both a source of challenge for me religiously, but it also opened a door to me that I'm forever grateful for, to spirituality, to religion, meaning making, and ultimately to the path that, as we were talking about, that I find myself continually choosing, which is the Gaudiya path. that's that sense of liminality, that kind of, that discomfort even with liminality, I think also colored the way I thought about religion, because I was aware that I was Hindu. We identify as Hindu. We use the word. I don't remember a time where I ever didn't, kind of know what my religion was in this. I mean, I must have asked at some point, but it was not like a gray area of, oh, I don't know what religion I am. So I would have been very, as a kid, if someone had said, okay, well, everyone state your religion, I would have been very comfortable saying I'm Hindu. But then as I got a little bit older, the question of what that meant was like a thorn in my side, right? And in a way that maybe is something that every person of faith, struggles with, just to figure out and define what that identity means. Maybe Christians and Jews and Muslims and Sikhs and everyone else goes through it too. For me, what felt a little challenging in I won't say a unique way, but in a way that felt fundamentally different from my, Christian and Jewish and Muslim friends for sure, was whenever religion would come up and we would talk about it, those friends seemed to have very concrete things that they could turn to in terms of, I remember going to my first bar mitzvah and it was just very clear.
Yeah.
There was like a structure here, right? And there was like, this is what it means to be Jewish. This is what it means to be, transitioning from boyhood to, what it means to be a man religiously and culturally. And, my Christian friends, my Catholic friends, they had their version of it as far as their milestones and, going to Bible classes and catechisms and, my Protestant friends and my Muslim friends, like everyone seemed to, not that they were uber religious, but they at least seemed to have like the vocabulary for it.
Yeah.
And I felt like I didn't. I felt like I had a vague sense. My parents weren't, I think they were very sincere, and I don't think it was just a generational thing. It didn't occur to them to think about religion as something that you needed to sort of understand in a systematic way or have a vocabulary for. It was just like something that was like a part of who we were. It was like we had a little shrine in our home.
Just to clarify, at this point, neither you nor your parents were connected to Gaudiya Vaishnavism as a tradition.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah. And I should be, maybe I should be a little bit more particular.
The broader Hindu designation as your religion, basically.
Yeah. And even there, because of, later I was able to sort of trace back and find some antecedents as far as like, there was like sort of Vaishnavism in my family at some point, and there was like a Shiva strain, and but that's only like later and kind of more as an academic exercise. But growing up, I wouldn't have even, those weren't meaningful categories to me. It was like, right, or to my family necessarily. We didn't identify with a particular sampradaya, or a particular guru or lineage. When we, like I said, we lived in New York, and there were Hindu temples, but we weren't, and we occasionally visited. There was no sense of regularity of like, oh, it's XYZ day of the week, we have to go. Or, it was like more like big festivals, or if there was something particularly going on in our lives that was like, oh, we need a little boost, we need a little extra blessing, or, or, the kind of like stereotype, but, if we got a new car or something, we needed to have it blessed, you go for the car puja.
Of course.
But even there, the decision of where to go, it was almost purely geographical. It was like, there's this temple nearby, and, or like, let's go to this temple because we haven't visited it before. And it'll be like, almost like, with like almost like a, not exactly touristic, but more of curiosity. And but so that was my experience. So it was definitely, not only was it disconnected from Gaudiya Vaishnavism, not only was it disconnected from Vaishnavism, but it was disconnected from, I would say, even conceptually, the notion of sampradayas, or the notion of distinct traditions and lineages that are dependent upon, teachers and things like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking probably all that added to the liminality you were already experiencing in your sense of, okay, I'm not belonging here nor there. Okay, I can if there's something I can identify with, okay, I'm a Hindu, but then when you enter into that category again, it's like, so where I am in this, no, it's not something very, as you say, clear or defined. So somehow the layers of liminality continue to increase even in that direction, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's like there's a kind of a frustration also, I feel like, because it wasn't just like, oh, well, none of this makes sense and therefore I can just reject it. There was also a very strong sense of connection. There was a strong sense of like, okay, I feel something here. This is meaningful. This is real. You know, I mean, we might use the word sincere or earnest, but whatever it is, there's, you know, yeah, to put it inelegantly, there's a realness here. But it's a realness that I can't articulate. I can't concretize. I can't wrap my hands around it, my mind around it. That feels kind of frustrated because, and the other piece I should add is, right, like, especially at this age, especially now going into my, let's say, kind of like prepubescent, like what we now call like teenagers. We didn't have that term when I was growing up, but like that kind of like right on the cusp of your teenage years. That's such a time of wanting to, in one way, of just feeling awkward about yourself generally, right? Like
teenage
your
years
body is just awkward.
They are designed to create an existential crisis from beginning of the day to the end for years.
Right. It's like neurologically, I'm not super into like neuroscience. I know a lot of people are into this stuff of, you know, when this frontal cortex is developing and this and that. But, you know, from the little I know, and especially now as a parent, which we can talk about later too, but like you said, it's almost designed for like existential crises, like on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And, you know, part of how you cope with that, or a lot of us, is like, I just want to conform. I just want to be like normal. I just want to let, and there's this tendency, I think, to like look at everyone else as normal. And then especially now bringing the sort of ethnic, racial, cultural piece, you know, growing up in America in the 80s and 90s, and then just really like being a TV watching, like I watched TV so much every single day. I was one of these kids that like the TV was just on.
You were a good American boy.
I was a good American boy, and practically everything I learned about American culture,
comes
you
from
know, more than school, was from it was from sitcoms. I was like a sitcom kid, right? So it's like the Cosby Show and you know, whatever, Growing Pains and Family Ties and all these shows, which, you know, for those who grew up watching those shows, you might have like a soft spot, because it was like, I grew up like, of course I knew it was fiction, but on a subtle level, I also was just really taking this in, like, this is what normalcy is.
Okay.
And my family doesn't look like this. It doesn't behave like this. I'm going to try to get them to. I used to force my parents to do all sorts of like stuff, to force them to like have these like Thanksgiving dinners that like looked like what I was seeing on TV, or just doing different activities, because there was such a craving to be quote unquote normal and American. And then religiously, it was like, again, okay, we have something. I don't want to completely reject it. It wasn't like I'm like, I want to junk this and just, you know, convert or something. But it was like, I want to figure out a way to make sense of this that would help me to feel like what I perceive to be everyone else. And
so Gaudiya Vaishnavism provided that sense of identity and that grounding. I mean, regarding to the question, right? What made you choose Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the context of this unique landscape of, let's say, uncertainty and craving for a sense of identity that you were going through, which of course it's the journey of so many of us in our own unique ways, right? Like a identity crisis, teenage years, wanting to be so much liminality and uncertainty for many of us in the past, and many times ascribing to a particular tradition, and as you say, sometimes wanting to conform because you want to take a break of so much liminality and so much uncertainty. Finally, they are telling me who I am. They are giving me all these absolutistic, conclusive answers. Okay, finally. Of course, after some time, that's not enough again, and you need to enter into another layer of liminality. But we will go there in a few minutes. How eventually you ended up embracing Gaudiya Vaishnavism, coming from such a background.
Yeah. So for me, it was, you know, again, I wouldn't have had the vocabulary or the base of knowledge to like seek out, Gaudiya Vaishnavism in particular. But as I said, it opened the door to this sort of like more like just a search anyway. And so I decided to, again, in that spirit of liminality, in that spirit of possibilities, I was like, I'm not going to limit myself. I just started doing, it sounds very cliche now maybe, but like did the whole, spiritual search, exploring different traditions, trying different things. I was a bookworm, and that's a habit I haven't outgrown. And so I just like, I had a library card. I had a New York City public library card. New York City has great public libraries, and I would just go and park myself at the library, and I just started reading anything I could get my hands on that was, philosophical, spiritual, metaphysical. I had a very brief flirtation with atheism and, agnosticism, and it just wasn't doing anything for me. And it just didn't, it sort of didn't make logical sense to me. It felt as sort of door closing as any sort of other fundamentalist, extremist kind of, I was just like, that just didn't do anything for me. So I had a sort of lowercase a agnosticism in terms of like, I was like, look, I'm not going to like, just believe in anything, just take everything at face value. But I had an openness, I think that again was sincere, and decided like, I'm going to look at different religious traditions. I'm also going to look at Hinduism because, right, like why should I discount Hinduism just because it's the thing closest to me? And I noticed a couple of things. One, I started noticing a pattern that wherever I was looking, the thing that really spoke to me was always something related to like mysticism and love, sometimes like poetry. I wouldn't have necessarily used the word devotion just yet, but there was like this sort of bhakti thread that, I was like starting to notice without having the precise language around it. So that was an interesting insight. And then another thing was that I was, I think, really drawn to, in a similar way, a kind of what I would now call like a personalism, in that I think I was very impressed by the notion of kind of all-pervasive divinity. And even while I'm impressed by it, I was still, I think, feeling like, well, but there's got to be a way also for that divinity to have I want to be in relationship with that divinity. Again, this is language I'm now using. I wasn't necessarily using it, but it was something that, again, I was starting to like, the picture was starting to come into focus. And anyway, as part of that search, and as I'm starting to become aware of, okay, these things are resonating with me more than others, I decided like, look, I think I should read the Bhagavad Gita, because I'm reading all this other stuff, and I sort of was a little intimidated by the Gita, but I was like, I'm going to read the Gita. And we had a copy of the Gita in our home that, interestingly enough...
Which edition?
Well, okay, so I'm getting to that. So like, interestingly enough, this particular Gita had been gifted, actually technically to me, years earlier when I was like a young kid. My one of my father's very good friends, who I always considered like, an uncle, like my father's best friend, basically. He, I don't know the full story of how he got it, but he got his hands on this copy of the Gita, and he brought it for me because apparently as a kid I really liked looking at these like Hindu art, like these like religious pictures, and this particular edition had these nice color pictures in it. And so, he said, "Oh, look, I brought this for my legal name is Vineet, for Vineet." And I was way too young to actually read it, but that ended up being like the sort of the only English copy of the Gita that stayed in our home. No one in our home actually read it. We just kind of kept it respectfully in the, converted linen closet that was our shrine. That was our like prayer space. And but now I reached for that Gita. I kind of wiped the dust off of it, so to speak. And of course, as many might have figured out already, this is the Bhagavad Gita as it is, Srila Prabhupada's, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's translation and commentary. And I started reading it. I was reading a little bit. I made a kind of a little vrata to myself to read just a little bit every day. To be honest, I would like the first chapter was like not an easy one to get through. If I'm being very honest, I didn't enjoy it. I found it very confusing. I found
so many names.
So many names. I was not the reading that I had been doing was very different than commentarial type of reading. So I wasn't used to the notion of as Prabhupada kind of uses the kind of quaint Victorian term purports. I wasn't used to purports. And just trying to figure out what a purport is, and then figuring out what is Prabhupada, what is this person trying to convey, and why are they speaking so strongly about things that it's like hard for me to even understand. Because if you're familiar, right, with Srila Prabhupada's commentary, particularly in that first chapter, even there's like a lot of like, it's almost like an introduction, like a purposeful introduction of a kind of a heaviness. I think, pedagogically now I can sort of see some, maybe like what he's trying to do there. I also, to be frank, also still struggle with it a little bit. And I struggle when I see other people struggling with it, when they're kind of trying to get through the Gita, when they're new to the Gita and they're trying to get through that first chapter. But anyway, long story short, I was committed to it because it was a vrat, but I wasn't, it was a difficult read. But around that same time, by Krishna's arrangement, my parents and a sort of family friend decided to finally, make this idea happen, which they had for months, if not years, to visit this place we had heard a lot about in West Virginia. That was this temple farm community, New Vrindavan. And especially right in those days, this would have been like the very early 90s, either I think 90 or 91. But in those days also, it was like, there, especially then, it was like sort of the Palace of Gold was the big, right? And in fact, a lot of, I remember it being, my family called it like the Golden Temple, the way we call like in Amritsar, just as a shorthand, a lot of like Indian families would.
That was a period. Like, the Golden Temple. That was a period in which New Vrindavan was part of ISKCON at that time. I don't recall the exact years where the whole situation was that they were kind of invited to leave, so to say, or not invited even. I don't know.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, they were black sheep. They were not in ISKCON.
Okay.
It's so interesting now looking back on it, but my family wouldn't have known that and wouldn't have cared necessarily. And so there was still, maybe the numbers went down. I don't know. I don't think they went up necessarily. But there were still influx of spiritual tourists and pilgrims and visitors coming to New Vrindavan. Yeah. So even though those were controversial times, and in many ways those were dark days, in other ways, New Vrindavan was still attracting people to come visit. For some, for some of us, and including my family, it was very kind of casual, like, hey, let's just do a road trip, and they definitely would not have described themselves as pilgrims. It was something a little bit still more pious than just going to Disneyland or something like that. There was a recognition that we are going to a temple, but it was some combination of kind of curiosity and tourism, and let's go and offer our respects to this temple or at this temple. And I was already, as I said, I was already kind of going deeper and deeper down my rabbit hole of spiritual seeking and searching. So it came at a particularly good time. I wasn't necessarily like thrilled about going to New Vrindavan. I didn't have any particular like positive associations with it. I may have actually even heard some rumblings of like, oh, there's some controversy over there, or some weirdness over there. But whatever, we went. And other than, I mean, when we first got there, I was totally weirded out, just aesthetically, visually. This is very overwhelming. And I was like, especially at you know, kind of like just the energy of night after having driven whatever it was, 8-9 hours, and then arriving, you know, in like sort of the middle of the night to this place where everyone is wearing these rather strange looking robes. And when I say robes, I mean literally robes, not dhoti chadar. I mean like actual Franciscan robes.
Like Franciscan monks, right, at that time?
Yeah, it was sort of Franciscan-esque, I would say.
Something like that, okay.
Yeah, it was kind of their own invention, but definitely modeled after some kind of Catholic orders. Yeah, interesting stuff. But somehow, despite that, like first not altogether pleasant, you know, impression, at least the next day and the day after, I think we were there for like 3 days. It ended up being a pleasant trip, and not just a pleasant trip, but I ended up meeting and talking to devotees. And now I should say before this, I was in the habit by now of like going to different spaces, including different Hindu temples, and asking questions and trying to engage people there in some conversation, because again, trying to be a spiritual seeker, and was usually pretty disappointed everywhere I went, because either there weren't satisfactory answers in some way, or even, you know, sometimes the questions themselves were not very welcome. And in some spaces it was almost like, you know, I got the sense, or even maybe was explicitly told, like, hey, stop asking so many questions. Like, you just do what everyone else does, right? Like, kind of almost like you're a troublemaker, and like you're annoying and pesky, which maybe I was, but I felt like I was coming from an earnest place. So I, you know, anyway, it was, you know, I was asking these questions and trying to get into conversations and discussion, and, you know, really with this desire to learn. And New Vrindavan, maybe it wasn't the only, but it was certainly, if not the first, one of the first spaces in which the questions were welcome. I was actually affirmed and appreciated for asking them. Like, I remember devotees being like, that's an intelligent question. Like, that shows that you're thinking about this, right? There might have been some flattery there, but I think also like they were appreciative that like all these families visit, but not everyone wants to engage philosophically. But here's this, you know, kid, a teenager or whatever, young person who wants to engage, and they welcomed it, and they were like kind of into it. And when I would challenge, they would have a response. And it wasn't like I was 100% convinced, but it was also like I was impressed that like they had something to say. I was impressed by the fact that it was, you know, now looking back on it, the liminality thing is interesting, because there was another kind of liminality there in New Vrindavan. It was, you know, very multi-ethnic. So I was also like now talking to devotees who were like, okay, wow, you were like raised in, you know, you came from like a Jewish background or a Christian background, but you adopted this and you're practicing this, and yet you see this as like, you know, completely harmonious and complementary and all part of the same, right? Like, there was something very attractive and compelling about that I realize now was also part of the story. It was like, oh wow, like these people have sort of figured out liminality in a way that is very powerful, actually.
I'm thinking, Venkata, that interestingly, because we all know, I mean, we all, not all, but some of us know that there were some pretty cultish stuff going on in New Vrindavan at that time simultaneously. I don't know if cultish is the word, but at the same time, I'm thinking...
Cultish is a word. We can use that word for sure.
But at the
Oh,
same
there are many
time,
words we could use for what's going on.
yeah, at the same time you are, and I'm bringing it in connection to the topic of cultic behavior that we were thinking about touching up. But at the same
Yeah.
time, you are mentioning how they were very open and appreciative of intelligent questions, which in one sense is the opposite of a cult, when many times you are not allowed to ask questions, actually. When too many questions
Yeah.
starts to be, as you say, you're a troublemaker, why you do not just surrender and submit. So it was this
Yes.
interesting mixture of openness and appreciation of inquiry and diversity, and at the same time, in
Yeah.
between all that, some cultish stuff. So this makes me think about this topic of cultic behavior, because of course it can be in itself a sensitive topic, but it's there both within outside Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I'm not saying Gaudiya Vaishnavism
Yeah.
is a cult, but we can live it and express it and represent it in cultish ways. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you would like to share a few thoughts of how you define cultic behavior or cultic attitudes, and yeah, why do you think they still persist in spiritual spaces like ours, of course, also
Yeah.
even in the context of some other patterns that are very broad-minded, open-minded, and yeah, the importance of detecting that cultish element, even when it's coming in between other elements which are non-cultish, no? Because sometimes we just think a cult has to be 108% cult, and if it's not that, it's not a cult, and maybe it's super bona fide, and we make this black and white distinction and lose the
Yes.
nuance in between, right?
Yeah. Totally. Totally. And it's, um, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it in that sense, but I think you're right. I think there's something really interesting going on. Um, I would say probably in the wider Gaudiya world as well, but definitely at
Mhm.
New Vrindavan, where on the one hand, right, if you want to talk about, and we can define this, in a little bit, but if you want to talk about cultish or cultic behavior or traits or culture, um, organizational culture, what have you, um, and I say this with still a lot of love for New Vrindavan. It's a whole journey. My
Right.
whole relationship with New Vrindavan is a journey, but I say this as someone who very much um, speaks as a well wisher and from the inside out, as someone who identifies with that place. But my gosh, yeah, at various times, New Vrindavan has been I would say, um, a really stark cautionary tale of for all of us, but particularly for Gaudiya devotees,
Mhm.
of how cultic things can get. And I have to say, the time that my family first visited is probably like the height of it in some
Mm.
ways.
Mm.
So there's such an irony, which I'd never really thought about, but there's such an irony that at the height of like New Vrindavan's kind of like, culty within a culty kind of, vibe, um, it's also simultaneously a space in which there's appreciation for questioning, there's intelligent discourse,
Mm.
there's devotees who are, you know, just thoughtful, thought
Yeah.
provoking, you know, full,
Yeah.
like multi-dimensional, you know,
Mhm.
interesting, powerful people, right? Like, and it's kind of like, I again, I'm glad you're bringing this up. I hadn't thought of it this way, but like,
Mm.
it just goes to show you, I think multiple things can be true at the same time,
Yeah.
right? Like, and it challenges us again, um, whether we're doing it as outsiders looking into something else, or even as insiders looking at our own tradition, that like, you know, there's always so much nuance,
Yeah.
and like,
Yeah.
I cringe when I sometimes hear devotees, especially devotees who didn't have much personal interaction with New Vrindavan, um, but maybe we're part of sort of like the mainstream ISKCON, world at that time. It really kind of it makes me cringe, and more than cringe, it actually like kind of annoys me or upsets me when I hear sometimes devotees who are just like, oh yeah, that New Vrindavan was just crazy, and like if
Mm.
anyone who like was down with that must be just like totally crazy or
Mm.
totally like
Mm.
brainwashed, and it's like you're just going to paint, with a
Yeah.
broad stroke, just
Yeah.
so much nuance out of the
Yeah.
picture, right? Now, having said that, what if I want to try to be a little bit critically reflective? What I will say is, I think what was going on in New Vrindavan at that time, and what happened and what happens, in spaces, including ours, where there is this kind of cultic overlay, is, and I think it's subtle and it's kind of unspoken, but often there is a kind of, there's like two levels, right? There's a level on which, or a context in which, you can say maybe two contexts is a better way of looking at it, but there's a context in which, yeah, we love questions. We love inquisitiveness. We love curiosity. We love all of that. Because in that context, it is part of our mission. It allows us to be good preachers or outreachers. It allows us to dialogue, right? It allows us to put our best foot forward, or allows us to be in this realm of the philosophy that we feel really comfortable in, whatever it is, right? But in this context, we're all about questioning, and we actually are super like open-minded, and right? And not that it's a front, it's genuine, but it's somehow it's like limited to that sphere. But then that same community, and sometimes those very same people, the very same devotees, without even realizing it, in different contexts, in the context of, let's say, fellow residents, or in the context of like, trying to raise concerns about inconsistencies that they're seeing in spiritual authorities or leadership, it's like almost like the 180 opposite, where it's like, you're offensive if you ask questions, or you're an apradi, or, that's just Maya trying to, plant seeds of doubt in your heart, and Prabhu, you just have to, right? And it's, we might say there's a cognitive dissonance there, but I don't think they experience it as, it makes sense. The internal logic helps it to make sense, where it's like, yes, we're open-minded. We love questions. But again, as defined, does that make sense? Or does that resonate with your experience?
And it makes the whole thing even more tricky again, because you can think of yourself as open-minded and give examples of how open you are to receive questions without seeing the dissonance between that and how in other particular scenarios you're absolutely close to any type of inquiry. And at the same time, as I was thinking, of course, we are not shooting here in New Vrindavan or anything. We are talking about the situation at large. How, going back to the point we made before, how sometimes you can find in one same place this multi-layered, multi-dimensional situation where there's genuine opens to inquiry and genuine cultic behavior simultaneously at different times in the same place or same people. And we should not be, with this I'm not saying, so therefore you have to be very careful to detect cultic behavior everywhere. I'm not only saying that, but also I'm saying you have to be very careful when you detect cultic behavior to also see the good things that are there apart from the cultic behavior. Because if not, we will make this point for us to become excessively skeptic and watch out. Cultic behavior is not only the things that come overtly in your face, but there can be in so many places. Yes, but also when you find that cultic behavior, do not put everyone in that same bag or everything related to that cultish group or person as cultish, because there may be some good non-cultic elements there as well. So as you mentioned, the word nuance, reality is nuance, and it's always its nuance, and the black and white thinking is so impersonal. Basically, it's like erasing all the minutiae and the specificity and the variety and just paint it black, as you will say. So talking about cultic behavior, and again, we touch upon some examples in the Gaudiya Vaishnava community and so on, but also you work as a chaplain. So in your work as a chaplain, in your interaction with people from different faiths, different traditions, have you encountered cultic tendencies, I assume, or how you have encountered them in non-Gaudiya spaces, even like in interfaith settings and yoga studios, and how do they compare with the challenges within the Gaudiya Vaishnava landscape, so to say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have encountered what I would kind of consider cultic. I know we haven't quite defined that term yet, but it's also, in a sense, there's
you can define. Yeah, we can
well,
define.
I was thinking about that, and I was like, even in the lead up,
hopefully a normalized definition, not necessarily satanic rites and strange stuff, but just quote unquote daily stuff that we may even engage in that being cultish in the sense of being, I don't know, narrow-minded, fanatical,
Right.
and so on and so forth. You can go, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have like a crisp definition of it. I thought of maybe trying to put something together, but then I realized like, no, it's probably better to just, some of it is, again, in the spirit of sort of trying to keep it like fluid and more casual. I think, a lot of it has to do with, things like, autonomy and control, sort of the ability to critically reflect and question, how much that questioning or reflection or even critical thinking is valued or not. I don't see it necessarily. I mean, it's kind of going back to your earlier point, where, I think there's a tendency, and both an individual tendency as well as like collectively or even historically, there is this tendency to think of it as like very either or terms, right? Like very categorical terms. Okay, is such and such a cult? And if it is, then I put it in this box. And I keep it in that box, right? And so how do I figure out if it is? Well, okay, I'm going to have a checklist. And if it meets all these criteria, okay, or maybe it meets, maybe it needs to meet 8 out of 10 of the criteria. Well, what do I do with the one that only has 5 out of 10? Okay, well, that's borderline, right? Like, so, or this is something that's just really weird and I don't understand it. And it's more convenient for me to slap a label on it and call it a cult. But the thing that I do is normal because I understand it or it makes sense to me or to my culture, to my family. So I won't call that a cult, right? And I think that has been understandably a real source of frustration. I think if you look at a lot of the, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and more particularly as an organization, ISKCON, because, I'm also talking about a time where there weren't many other, Gaudiya organizations on the landscape. So, I think in earlier years when ISKCON was really coming under attack as a cult, and I'm intentionally using language like attack because I think that was very much the mode, right, from both sides. I think it was meant to be an attack. I think it was perceived as an attack. But the idea then was, or the kind of the mood was, you guys are a cult. And ISKCON kind of defending, saying, no, we're not. We're a legitimate religion. No, you're not a real religion. You're a cult. And it was like in this very, you can even hear it in the language, right? Cult is a noun. So it's like either you are this thing or you're not this thing, as opposed to thinking about it as an adjective. It's as a quality of something, right? And so when you look at those early, and I want to come back to your question, but when you look at some of those early sort of battles that ISKCON had to fight with the anti-cult folks, look at how ISKCON responded, and I think it was a smart strategy, in a way. But what ISKCON did was when I say ISKCON, of course, there's no one monolithic ISKCON, but what leaders and spokespersons and the communications office or the PR office or whatever it was called at the time, the way that those folks chose to respond was they said, look, you're trying to box us into this noun, but we're going to show you we're not this noun, we're this other noun. And so you're trying to say we are this thing called a cult, and we're going to prove to you that we're not. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to get scholars to say, well, no, actually, this goes back thousands of years to, or hundreds, if not thousands of years to, this Indian tradition. And Chaitanya was this teacher, right? Like, so they used academics and history, religious history and theology, and right, to say, no, don't put us into this category, put us into this other category. And then I agree. And I think it was a well-earned victory in some ways. If you look at the way ISKCON was, not always, but often able to push back against that label of cult. I think where we've shifted, and where many, even in the anti-cult world, which has also evolved, where I think they've shifted as well, and where we're in much more agreement now, is that old way of doing things, where it's like slap a label on something you don't like and call it this. that's very limited, and that's fraught also because it invites bias, right? Most of the folks in the anti-cult world, by the way, were also very much, you can say, driven by a certain Christian, and more particularly evangelical Christian agenda, right? So it wasn't just objectively, oh, I'm going to critique you as a cult because cults are bad and I want to save society. It was, you guys are evil, you're a cult, you're evil, you're doing Satan's work, and you're preventing people from seeing the light of Christ, right? So again, that's then where I think, there's been some movement is, what if we move away from that and we start looking at it not so much as, either a group or a community or even an individual person is or isn't a cult or an occult, as a static, kind of category. But let's start talking about behavior and actions and culture. And then that opens up a whole possibility of, again, multiple multiple truths
of each of us being cultish on some level many times also.
On some level. And then now I have to do the hard work, but it's good hard work of being like, wait a second, like, where am I? Where are my blind spots? Where am I cultish? If we want to look at cult, being cultic or cultish in that way, where am I blindly following something? Where am I, driven by a kind of a fanaticism? Where am I practicing a sort of literalism to the point of being harmful? Right? I'm not saying all literalists or all literal interpretations are wrong, but there is a kind of a slavishness to kind of a slavery to literalism, if you want to put it that way. I realize that's strong language, but that can be really destructive to someone's development of faith and to the development of not just individual faith, but to development of a community. Where am I as guilty of that as the big bad leaders that I'm pointing at? So once we shift the conversation to cultic and cultish, I feel like that's a much more interesting conversation, but it's a much more confronting one, because now it's not just about slapping the label and being done with it. It's about constant, and again, kind of tying back to your very first question about the constant choice, just as it's a constant choice to follow a path.
Constant vigilance and revisiting inside the cultish elements that get in the way of constantly choosing the proper path, right?
Absolutely. And that, an aspect of it is facing outward and taking a good hard look at the organizations that we're a part of, or the actions of leaders, or what have you. That is part of it. But just as important a part of it is like, okay, where am I at? How am I acting? How am I reading this? How am I allowing myself to be treated? How am I treating others, right? All of that. Much messier, but much more, I think, needed and fulfilling. And going back to the whole New Vrindavan thing, I mean, I think part of my journey has been, and in a way makes it for me that much more meaningful to think about choosing Gaudiya Vaishnavism, because I feel like by Krishna's arrangement and through, whatever karmically I was, meant to go through, I kind of went through this roller coaster ride of finding this path, being introduced to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, being introduced to teachers like, Srila Prabhupada, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, to the like broader parivar of Bhakti-Santa Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, of, the sort of the Rupa Nuga, like all of these really amazing personalities and the kind of culture that they've collectively co-created and subcultures within all of that. I came through New Vrindavan at a time when New Vrindavan wasn't even a part of its mainstream parent organization. In a way that, like, you can't separate that. Like, now I can sit and, we can draw all sorts of charts and go, okay, well, this was just Chaitanya Vaishnavism or Gaudiya Vaishnavism. and this had nothing to do with New Vrindavan. And this was, this is like ISKCON, standard ISKCON belief. And this was like the weird thing that New Vrindavan was doing. You could put it all on a chart now, and there'd be some overlapping, right? It might be an interesting academic exercise to look at, right? Like what I was learning and studying and what having my mind blown and my heart opened by, and just analyzing like how much of it was Mahaprabhu and how much of it was, traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism versus like modern, and how much of it was just New Vrindavan and how much of it was Kirtanananda Swami and how much of it was, this person and that person. We could do all that. It's an academic exercise. It might be kind of fun and interesting. Good way of spending a rainy afternoon or something like that. But practically speaking,
not too many.
That's not like a lived experience.
Yeah,
don't many afternoons.
Don't take that many afternoons for that.
But when you live through it, you don't think that way. You just it's all one package deal. And so for me, right, like discovering Gaudiya Vaishnavism, discovering Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Like I had this experience where when I had probably read about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. I definitely read about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the Gita, in Prabhupada's Gita for sure. Yeah. So I had some conceptual knowledge, but I also had this distinct memory of standing in front of the altar at New Vrindavan and trying to make sense of Gaur-Nitai, because they have Gaur-Nitai deities on the left side of Sri Sri Radha Vrindavan Chandra, who are the presiding deities. And I remember like, maybe I had a theoretical, I don't think I really knew who Nityananda Prabhu was, even on a conceptual level. I had some conceptual idea that, okay, this path believes in Chaitanya, and this edition of the Gita, the author, the commentator is talking about Chaitanya and Chaitanya as Krishna in the modern age and Kali Yuga. But it was still like very mind-blowing, right?
As I like to say, we can very easily get polytheistic with such an wide array and parade of faces of the divine in our tradition. So important to have a proper non-dual foundation of the unified expressions of that same person, because if not, it's like, again, Mahaprabhu, Nityananda, Varahadev, Nrsimhadev, and in one sense, they are all the same person.
I had also never seen Jagannath deities or Jagannath, like even a painting, because my family is from North India, and somehow I wasn't exposed to, I'm sure my parents were, but I wasn't exposed to
which was
Odisha or Jagannath.
Your first thought when you have the first darshan of Jagannath? Totem like ecstatic figure extending his hands to you.
I think it was more just like why are there giant smiley faces, right? Like it was like I almost thought of it like, probably these days it would be emojis. We didn't have emojis then, but I was just like, oh yeah, like you have those like those like smiley face stickers or something. I was just like, this big smiley face, right? But again, like just to say, going back to the original point, just to say like that it's an academic luxury to pull all these things apart. The lived reality was like it was all part of one whole experience, and that was my kind of coming to Krishna, coming to Mahaprabhu, coming to our path, our family kind of experience. And then it kind of came crashing down when the spiritual compromises and ethical issues and difficulties that the leader then, who I had, at least on a theoretical level, had started to aspire for initiation from, Kirtanananda Swami, then known to us as Srila Bhaktipad. When the proverbial shit hit the fan, pardon my Sanskrit, when that happened,
another layer,
again, I was
another layer of liminality to add to your story in that moment. I can imagine.
Liminality, confusion. Also, I was sort of like half in, half out, because I never lived in New Vrindavan, wasn't an initiated disciple. But I identified by this point in the in the story, it should have been like 93 or 94. But I think it was maybe summer of 93. But by this point in the story, like I'm, I really identify with these people. They're like my people. Bhaktipad is like my guru on some level. I'm jumping around, fast forwarding, a lot happened in between. But anyway, that was like a major crisis of faith, because now it's like, I don't know what to do. The person who introduced me most significantly and most, you can say, personally to Krishna consciousness, who was like my Vartman Pradarshak, but also my kind of, not just guru, but like my family, like my big sister in Bhakti. You know, she was devastated spiritually, and she took not just a big step. I mean, she, you know, realized that she could no longer consider this person her guru. So that was like a crisis in faith, because it's like the person who brought me to this path in a way. So, you know, all that. And then in a very real way, I had to rediscover Gaudiya Vaishnavism outside of that context and in a whole new context. And that new context now is like
going back again to the first question: why to remain as a Gaudiya Vaishnava? To continue
so literally
find reasons, real reasons to stay.
Get to find real reasons. Because at that point, I also like, you know, it's funny because I remember having even a conscious thought that I was like, hey, like, dude, if you want an out, like, now's your out, you know, like, you've done this thing for a little while, right? For like a, you know, year and a half, 2 years, whatever. Well, I don't know the exact dates. But like, you know, you've been identifying with this thing.
You won't have any good enough excuse to leave after this. So this is a way out now, never.
If there was ever a time to just be like, see ya, you know, like, I'm done with this and I'm moving on to the next thing or whatever, right? Like, this is it, you know, like, the window is open, and like, no one, right? Because there's always that little bit of like, I think in like economics, they call it like the sunken cost fallacy, right? It's like, I've already put energy into this. I've already put time into this. Like, I'm not going to walk away now. But then like a window opens up, and it's like, you know, like, no one would fault me. And like you said, there's never going to be a better time to just like walk away, because like, this place is a mess. I'm done. And so I remember having this conscious thought, like, if you want to walk away from this whole thing, from this idea, this like crazy idea of like, you know, this, you know, this manifestation of God who is simultaneously Radha and Krishna, and who, right, like, all this like stuff that about our tradition that is so beautiful, but so like wild and so like beyond what we can comprehend. It's like, you could walk away from all of that.
C.S. Lewis will say, God is wild. So
God is wild.
So it has to be.
I mean, Kierkegaard, also another person we admire, philosopher we admire, you know, would speak in very much the same way. That kind of almost like, you know, trans-rational absurdity. But, you know, anyway, all to say, like, I kind of had it, you know, again, it was in a very real way, another time to like, okay, I'm gonna like, do I opt in? Do I opt out? Like, I get to choose this again. I get to like a kind of a do-over. And for better and for worse, like, my version of the do-over was like, okay, I'm gonna like, this path still has meaning. Prabhupada as an acharya still has meaning. The Guru Parampara still has meaning. And even specific teachers who I encountered through New Vrindavan still have meaning for me, in a very big way. The person who became, who, you know, I took initiation from, who became my Diksha Guru and continues to guide me in that role. You know, he has meaning, and his the love and care that he's shown to me, and you know, all that has meaning. And like, but it was very intentional choices.
And I will argue, Venkataji, that even all the things that you mentioned, Prabhupada and the philosophy and your guides, still had meaning. But I will say that in the midst of such a grief and such a loss and such a crisis, the meaning that they had now becomes deeper, like, for you to continue and find new reasons to continue. The meaning that they already had for you, now they are newly discovered on another level, and that what's not only allows you to continue, but to even go deeper in your continuing, right?
Well, I also had to like sort of, it was like, I mean, it was painful at times. There was grief, like I appreciate that you used the word grief, but there was also like, it was exciting, right? You get like a new, it was almost like I get to see, you know, Prabhupada and Mahaprabhu and devotees and the Bhagavatam and all this. I get to almost like revisit them and see them, you know,
discovery,
now separated out from this other stuff or this other person and his kind of, you know, his imprint on it. And it was an interesting thing, right? I got to rediscover Prabhupada.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just like a side note, but at this time, I also was really moved by and informed by and really helped by and healed by a lot of the writings of Satsarup Das Goswami, both in terms of reintroducing me or introducing me to aspects of Prabhupada that I had never known about or learned about, but also some of his more confessional writing, some of his more avant-garde artistic writing. You know, he was like the first devotee author that I encountered. And as someone who dabbles in writing and who's like, as I said, a bookworm, I really felt a personal sort of appreciation where he was like the first sort of Vaishnava who I experienced showing a lot of vulnerability in his writing and showing that side of like the struggle and talking about struggle, you know, with chanting and struggle with, you know, the mind and struggle even as a guru, which I was like, this is, you know, especially coming off of this, you know, this crisis that a lot of it had to do with Bhaktipad, you know, for some reasons that I now feel a lot of sorrow in my heart for, and I feel like sad for him in many ways. Although I also feel, you know, I feel angry at those, you know, at the sort of the violence, the rhetorical and literal violence that he perpetrated. But I also feel deeply sorry for him. But part of his whole thing was he had to put on such a front of like being infallible.
Yeah.
And so it was so refreshing to go from that to now reading, like, I'm just remembering like reading some of Satsuru Maharaj's writing where Satsuru Maharaj is like talking about like his own, like, you know, his own process of recognizing where he went wrong as a, you know, as an initiating spiritual master, as a guru. And like, I was just like blown away, like this kind of like honesty and reflection and vulnerability is possible. And, you know, not to say that, you know, I'm not saying everyone has to like love his writing and, you know, fine, we're all like complex people, but
we still need so much of that today. What to speak, not a few decades ago, we still need so much, not only of gurus holding themselves accountable, but expressing genuine humanity, genuine transparency, not trying to be in the eyes of others more than who they are. There's no need. Normalizing. Let's normalize. Let's normalize normalcy. Let's put it that way. Like,
100%. I love that. Normalize normalcy.
Being normal, being human, being honest, and as long as you're honest and sincere, even if you share with me your struggles, if they come from an honest and sincere place, those will nourish my faith. No, so for me,
and that's what happened.
For me, the real problem is when we receive this narrative, like my faith can only be nourished if you're a superhero as my guru. Now, if you as my leader are infallible and perfect, and only then you can inspire the community. And instead, we need to rediscover or reinstate, in my opinion, like a new form of inspiration that, as you mentioned, includes vulnerability, includes the possibility of sharing struggles, and in a way that it nourishes others. No? Because sometimes we get this wrong, and no, people will only be inspired if I am infallible in everything I do. But that's not real. That's not sustainable. So we are creating inspiration on the basis of a lie, basically, instead of normalizing normalcy, right?
I love everything you just said, and I'm you know, connecting it to my new Vrindavan experience. I mean, I think Krishna accomplishes many things at once, right? And like Krishna is so dynamic. Some things are Krishna through the workings of karma and collective and individual karma. Some things are Krishna's direct intervention and direct orchestration. I'm not saying it's the only way of looking at it, but among ways of looking at it, I feel like New Vrindavan and even those dark years of New Vrindavan, and the whole story and the whole arc of New Vrindavan, which, by the way, doesn't end necessarily with perfection or utopia even today, but ends with, but continues a story of vigilance and reflection and tension and all this stuff. But I think there's so much to learn for all of us. And like what you just said about like this thing of like, you know, this sort of like trap that we can fall into of I'm nourished when my guru is the infallible superhero, and that's the only way to like keep a community together. Like if New Vrindavan has taught us nothing else, then hopefully, you know, it can teach us that lesson. I mean, I think it has many lessons to teach us, but I think that's one that was like huge. And that was very much my story of rediscovering Gaudiya, the Gaudiya path, and rediscovering it again, like I said, for better and for worse. Some people might say, you know, out of the frying pan into the fire. But, you know, then kind of getting into like, you know, capital I ISKCON, right? Like after being introduced to Krishna consciousness or to Bhakti or to Gaudiya Vaishnavism, in this still kind of like fringe, like more on the periphery kind of thing, to now then be in this sort of like very like, I mean, ISKCON in some ways, depending on what your metric is, could still be seen as very fringe and very out of the box and avant-garde, but at least in a certain Gaudiya way, or in a certain, you know, in a certain understanding of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, definitely much more institutional, organizational, especially during like the 90s, right? Post sort of the Zonal Acharya days, post, if you're familiar with ISKCON history, like post the sort of guru reforms, and where it's like now much more like the attention is much more on like the whole, the institution, like Prabhupada at the center, but Prabhupada at the center in this very like mediated through the organization way. And then, apropos of, again, this sort of like constant negotiation and renegotiation, then if you think about, you know, or if you're familiar with what was going on in like the 90s, then jumping into in the late 90s, now all of a sudden all these tensions around like, well, there's like all these other Gaudiya folk doing stuff. And now there's like, and I mean, not now, there always has been, but there's like, you know, stuff going on with Ritvikism, and there's stuff going on with this thing and that thing. And now there's like all these like other dynamics. And so again, there's this constant negotiation, reevaluation of like, okay, like, so I'm pretty sure I want to like continue to identify with Gaudiya, but like now, like suddenly I'm like, oh, there's much more to Gaudiya than just even this one organization. So like, I have like friends who, I mean, which is true. Like I did have friends who at this time, like went and, you know, heard Srila Narayan Maharaj speak, and, you know, were, depending on how you looked at it, either convinced or, you know, moved or transformed or whatever, you know, depending on which narrative track you follow. But like suddenly it's like, oh, like this person is my friend, was my friend, maybe is my friend, but now there's all this institutional tension, which you don't see as much these days. But in those days, at least, it was like, this person is maybe like literally banned from attending the temple that they used to attend. And how am I making sense of that? And I'm not like really cool with that. It's like my friend, but I also understand and can sympathize with maybe where the leadership of this organization is coming from, because I do see, I'm not entirely comfortable with what I feel to be a kind of like perf war type of thing developing. And I'm not, I gave one particular example by name, which maybe I shouldn't have, but the point is not at all like ISKCON and Narayan Maharaj. No. That's just one example, but there are multiple examples at this time, right?
One example
and continue to be.
Swami Padmanabha could be one example.
Well, yeah,
not to put me in the spotlight, but just to mention how these dynamics continue to happen in so many ways.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I mean, so again, to your larger point, going back to some of the themes that we've raised, again, those two ended up being, you know, depending on how you look at it, either you're forced to, or you now have the, you know, you're now gifted the opportunity to have to go back and again do that choosing and evaluating and that intentional, like, you know, not just, I guess you could allow yourself to just fall into the status quo, but hopefully, you know, we're constantly critically thinking about things and thinking things through. And it's like, again, those are opportunities to think about like, okay, like, where do I want to be? The other thing I know this is, I'm enjoying this conversation or this opportunity to share. I'm also aware that maybe I'm it's a little scattered, which is okay sometimes.
Fine.
But one thing I didn't want to forget, because you mentioned it earlier, and I made a mental note to bracket it and come back to it, is I really appreciated also your example of, or your evoking of, the idea of initiations, whether it's, taking sannyas vows or diksha or harinam, or however traditions understand these different markers and milestones. But I appreciate so much you're challenging us to think about those as not just a one and done, or not as a goal to be achieved and then check, I did it and now I'm there and I've arrived. And one of the reasons that resonates so much with me is, I think if I'm honest in reflecting on my own journey, right, there was a certain time, again, correlating to this sort of period of transitioning into and kind of assimilating into mainstream ISKCON, and then kind of formally aspiring for initiation along the parameters set up, within the organization. Because it's a very interesting thing, right? Which we can talk about if you're interested in it. But the sort of idea in organizations like ISKCON, maybe in others, but I'm speaking specifically about ISKCON, where initiation kind of means different things simultaneously. So it's about the relationship with the guru, the teacher, but it's also, kind of like a low-key institutional membership card type of thing. Like, no one says that exactly, but it's sort of understood, and like it's like your street cred, and it's like, this is also the days of counting strands on the kanti mala. So it's like, look at so and so has got the the 2 strands, so they're like on the way, and this person's got the 3 or the 4, and so therefore they're like legit, right? And again, being now in the late 90s, being a teenager, entering into my late teenage years, like now facing my my 20s, my young adulthood, again, a time of a lot of trying to figure out who you are and identity formation and all that stuff. Very quickly and very subtly, it became a thing where it's like, okay, like initiation is the goal. And it's the goal because when I get initiated, then, and again, I'm not sure I would have admitted this, but it was there somewhere deep inside. Yes, it's about this eternal relationship with the guru. Yes, it's about learning. Yes, it's about all these things. But also deep down inside, it's like when I get there, then I'll have proven myself as legit. I'll have proven myself as like, I belong.
We all crave for belonging. So I can also
crave for it. And then
I can empathize with our big thirst for belonging and running after initiation as that, the key for belonging. I'm not.
It's the key that unlocks that whole belonging thing. And going back to the liminality thing, if you're already, struggling, especially sensitive to this notion of, neither here nor there, and I don't belong, and I'm this kind of, all this imagery that we talked about, this liminality, it's like on a certain level, again, not conscious maybe, but subconscious, there's this sense of like, well, maybe it was all building up to this moment, and this will be like the grand finale, neat, it'll all come together, and the package will be tied with a neat bow and initiation, and it'll do it full stop, right?
Crowning ceremony, and that's the end of it all. And interestingly, initiation, the very word initiation indicates that you are initiating something, not that it's the end goal and everything is concluded, right?
Right.
In the word initiation, you have the main point. You are beginning something. It's not the end.
You're beginning something.
It's the end of something, but it's the beginning of something else. It's always like that, right? But
yeah. Well, it's, and that even though like I would have probably, if you had asked like the 18-year-old me or 18-year-old me, I would have probably said, yes, initiation's a beginning, again, parroting those words that I'd heard from others. But in my heart, it was like, it's going to happen. I'm going to arrive. And then it's going to be like, the whole reason I felt like such a liminal misfit and I was never quite comfortable in my skin and all of that, it will all poof magically disappear, because I won't be, that Vineet will will be a distant memory, and I will be whatever. I thought I was going to get a real Vrindavan name, so I will be like, Vrindavan so and so, Vraja so and so, and my life will be, that'll be it. That'll be the fulfillment. And guess what? Didn't happen. I mean, it was beautiful. It felt wonderful, fulfilling in that. It was like Purna in that sense. It was fulfilling, but it was a beginning. It wasn't
it's a
blessed
process.
end.
I always like to make the point. Initiation is a process. No, I like to quote. There's a line in Chaitanya Charitamrita says, Diksha Kale Bhakta Kare Atma Samarpana. Says Diksha Kale, at the time of Diksha or initiation, let's say, Bhakta Kare Atma Samarpana. At that time, the devotee makes of himself a full offering to Krishna. So if you understand initiation as just one time performance thing, I receive initiation.
Yeah.
If I look back and I realize I was not a full offering to Krishna at that time. I'm not a full offering to Krishna today even. So what does it mean that at the time of initiation that happens? Again, what does it mean the time of initiation? Maybe when initiation, the process of initiation becomes complete, mature, fully blossom. That happened. That's the Diksha with all capital letters. But Diksha in the beginning is the kickstart of the whole process, right? And but I appreciate what you mentioned, Venkataji, because it helps also to deal with this type of processes with compassion and with self-compassion, because sometimes we may overtly criticize people. Oh, you are thinking that initiation is just a one-time act, or you are escaping from this, but actually, no, you have a deep need for belonging, like all of us have. And in our naivete, we think, okay, by receiving this, by going through this sacred moment or ritual, finally I will take rest of my liminality, my non-belongingness, my feelings of being an exile, an outcast. But it all comes from a genuine need and a fragility and vulnerability. And eventually we come to realize there's much more to that. And in connection to initiation, something that comes to mind, Venkata, is that also the fact that, because if we, as you mentioned, we make of initiation much of a, like a, I don't know, it's the moment that I will receive my membership card, and after that I'm in, so I can rest. I don't have to be concerned about anything. I'm in. And we lose sight of how many other initiation moments come into life. So I like to think also of initiation not only as Harinam, Diksha, Sannyas, something ritualistically performed, but life moments that initiate us, so to say. Moments of suffering, also moments of grief, moments of loss, moments of joy that are very defining spots in our timeline, so to say, that literally we can call them initiations, right? Like something in us die at that moment and something else is born. Clearly, before and after. There's the before and after of me up in that particular situation. So I like always to broaden even the notion of initiation, not only as a process that is ongoing and began at one point, but also as initiation being life circumstances that kind of take us to another place. I don't know what you think about that.
I love that. Like life is like it's a collection of these, initiations, these small and large and initiations that are just and sometimes, or maybe even very often, it's literally, it's like between me and Krishna. Like it may go completely unseen, but it's but so significant, right? It also reminds me of something when I was studying, because I've studied a little bit in terms of just along with my chaplaincy role, or you can say my what I try to offer as a chaplain. I also sometimes in some situations officiate over ritual, officiate over samskars. And when I was studying, this kind of science or art, you can say, or culture of samskar, one of the things that I don't remember where exactly I read this, but it was a very similar idea that the shastras and the traditions, and they identify certain concrete markers in the typical lifespan of a person as kind of more formalized samskars, but those are really meant to be the kind of like the just like larger goalposts along the way, you can say, or the larger sort of flags that are planted along the way. But the real the real idea is that I'm not doing it justice to the way that I read it, but it's like everything that we do every day that we live, there's samskars. If we think about samskar in the literal sense of impressions being made, right?
Yeah, that's how I like to connect the two terms. Samskars as a ritual or ceremony, but samskar as an impression. So those rituals are intended to create in us an impression, a mark of rites of passage, let's say, certain crucial moments of life. But as you said, they are not limited to those particular moments, but what happens in between. It's if you say it's a constant initiation by life itself, right? So I like this idea of thinking not only I'm initiated by such and such guru, but I'm initiated by life. No, life circumstances initiate me constantly. But how much do I allow myself to be initiated? How much of a disciple I am? How much I'm accepting the initiation that I'm being invited to by particular situations? And for me, the initiation with the guru, or the role of the guru, should be also to instruct the disciple in a way that the disciple broadens his or her idea of initiation and guru, and sees guru in other parts and places, and life itself, circumstances, are guru coming to give me diksha, so to say. I'm being initiated by this situation. And I also go through that as a sacred chapter, as an initiation, as a death, as a new birth, as a guru teaching me a lesson. The guru has to teach that. So for me, that original diksha is a process in that sense. It's a process where we start to find initiation is happening all the time if we are open to it.
Oh, I love that idea. It also makes me think, though, that one of the challenges, and I think it's a good challenge to have, but one of the challenges I feel like with looking at being initiated by life is sometimes we can only really, it feels like we can only really appreciate or learn from that initiation with the benefit of a little time and space. So like in the moment, if we kind of extend that analogy or that metaphor, in the moment of initiation, I'm too sort of in it for most of us, or at least for me, I'll say, I feel like I'm too in the situation. I'm too in the moment to be able to like have that wider perspective. But with a little bit of space and time, it's like, oh, I see now how life was initiating me. I see now how Paramatma was at work. I see now how, right? And now again, maybe I'm just feeling this way because I didn't intend to even speak about this, but sharing that, it's very emotional for me, but sharing that's sort of the new Vrindavan connection and those early days, there's a lot there, a lot of gratitude. There's mixed feelings, but overwhelming gratitude. One of the things I see now is in a way, like I was, again, to use the term more loosely, I was initiated by that experience. I was initiated by New Vrindavan, not just the place, but the experience. I was initiated by the crisis of faith. I was initiated by all of that, right? And in a sense, continue to be, to the extent that it now shows up for me. One of the things that was so meaningful to me in a way that it only hit me a little bit later was, a couple of years ago, my family made a trip to New Vrindavan, and we realized that my daughter, my wife and I realized our daughter was the same age in that trip that I was when I first went to New Vrindavan. And just to have her like, it's just a little thing, but it felt I almost felt like I was like, it felt surreal, to be honest, to have her just like walking in some of the same spaces or, standing in front of the same deities, or in some cases, because there's some, older residents who have stayed there and who I see and who like they know me and maybe even remember me kind of perpetually, right? Sometimes people get frozen in your mind and they may remember me. They may look at me still with my gray beard and they still may see me as that, that 13-year-old or whatever. And it was just amazing to introduce them to my daughter and to like, to say, to feel like a genuine sense of like connection. It was quite emotional, actually. So it's still affecting me in a way that I don't feel like I think I'm only now beginning to, consciously process and unpack and even talk about with other people. I don't talk about with a lot of devotees, but somehow Krishna inspired that, to kind of go in that direction for this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for opening to the possibility of you ending up in this particular direction, and I appreciate the full circle that you have been able to go through. You visiting there again with your daughter, and somehow it maybe felt like in one sense, going back to the same place in a circle, but not in a circle that you are just doing the same thing and you are the same person, but more like a spiral, like in
Spiral,
the same
yes.
place but with new eyes, and again in the same place with the new eyes. And like again, going back to our original question, I'm a Gaudiya Vaishnav, rediscovering Gaudiya Vaishnavism, how to continue, why I can choose to be. Still, I am here in the same place, quote unquote. I'm a Gaudiya Vaishnav, but from which place do I choose today to be that?
Yeah.
And it's.
I mean, one aspect of that we haven't even, we haven't even unpacked, or we haven't even gotten to. I mean, there's so many conversations can be had, but even thinking about that beautiful imagery of the spiral, and like, I am a Gaudiya Vaishnava. Here I am again saying I'm a Gaudiya Vaishnava, but it's like, it's in a different way now. It's through different eyes, or, but there's also a sense of like, I'm a different person.
Yeah.
And so when I say so it's like, I am a Gaudiya Vaishnava. My understanding of what it means to be a Gaudiya Vaishnava has changed. My understanding of I has changed, right?
Yeah, we
like,
don't need even to go, I'm a Gaudiya, but I. Let's stop in I.
It's like, stop there, like, right? And it's like, what does it mean to be a Gaudiya? What does it mean to tell someone you're a Gaudiya Vaishnava? What does it mean to tell yourself you're a Gaudiya Vaishnava? What is it? Like, all of that. I get accused. I was just hearing, anyway, maybe I'm not even going to get into it, but I won't get into the context, but I was just hearing, and maybe it's purifying for me, but someone was critiquing something that I had spoken in another context. And they were saying basically that, like, oh, these like academic types, they're just interested in deconstructing everything, right? As like a put down, right?
Okay.
And they're like kind of making fun of me because I get into this thing of like, well, like, yeah, like, what does it mean? What does I mean? What does M mean? What does Gaudiya mean? Right? So I get that, like, to some of the folks like listening or watching this, they may go like, come on, like,
but
if you do that,
I know
you can deconstruct everything.
Yeah, I know it can sound a little obsessive, or like you're too much of a follower of Jacques Derrida and the constructionist of everything. But
yeah, right.
Then we need to stop and not take for granted even the usage of words. Like, we are, even the word I, what it means, I, really. It's not like an intellectual play. It's just, what do you mean by I? When you say I am, what do you mean by I am? What do you mean I am a Gaudiya? Or like we were talking, initiation. What does it mean, initiation? If you don't rediscover the content of that term, you may just get stuck in an idea, and initiation became a membership card, and I already have that membership card, so I do not relate to the word initiation anymore as an ongoing phenomenon that should be happening on a daily basis. So and the way to rediscover the term is maybe going back to initiation and ask to the word initiation, ask myself, what is initiation? And as you were saying, if we are really open to the implications of the meaning of the word, that's something, initiation is something that should be happening on a daily basis many times per day, and not something, a relic from the past that just can happen once, right? So for me, there is a big reason to not to be like an obsessive deconstructionist, but just to be open to pay attention even to words, the words we use, what's the meaning of them, because language crafts our experience, right? So we use certain terms, but attached to the terms we use, there's certain understanding of the term, and all that takes to a certain way of living and seeing reality, ourselves, Krishna. So sometimes we may need to recalibrate those filters and readjust and continue in this spirit of rediscovery. So anyhow, Venkataji, we are almost about wrapping up, but before concluding, we have a few more minutes. And as you may know, in our tradition, sometimes in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, there's this saying in Sanskrit, Madhurena Samapayat, which basically means at the end, let's begin with something sweet. Can apply to eating departments, but also sometimes in Harikatha or something. But now I'd like to inaugurate with you, and sorry to have you as a Pinayak pig, like another variety of it. We can call it in English, I think it's Ushnena Samapayat, which is, let's end with something hot, something spicy.
Ooh.
Something spicy.
I have a very low spice tolerance, actually, when it comes to food. I might have mentioned this in Radhakund, but I'm always the guy that, like, and people get surprised because they assume, coming from an Indian background, oh, you must be able to handle your spice. So I'm open to it, but just know that I have a low spice tolerance.
Okay. So I'll present a brief set of short questions, short hot questions. Not so hot, don't be scary. Like, It's cold over there in
Okay.
New York, so it's good. Some hot will help.
Yeah.
I will expect a similarly short, hot answer from you. Something that
All right.
like a ping pong, like very quickly answer, quick and
Got
clear.
it.
Okay, we'll conclude with that and then some closing reflection. Number one,
Sure.
what's the biggest blind spot of Gaudiya Vaishnava institutions right now?
Biggest blind spot, literalism.
Okay. So the second question may be similar, but I invite you to make it more nuanced and say something different. In this connection, if you could remove one habit or tendency that holds the Gaudiya community back, what will it be? And don't say literalism, they say something else.
No, I'll say something else. I'm sorry. Can you repeat the prompt?
Yeah, of
I'm
course.
messing up the ping pong
Yeah,
game, but I
yeah.
need to
If
hear it
you, if
again.
you could remove one habit or one tendency that holds the Gaudiya community back, what will that be?
I would say a knee-jerk reaction to determine whether something is bona fide or bogus.
Okay,
And that
great.
kind of use of that binary.
Yeah, yeah. Similarly, also, what's a verse or a concept or an idea from our tradition, or at least from how the tradition is represented, that we are overemphasizing to the detriment of other teachings?
Um, I'm not thinking of a particular verse,
Yeah.
but at least I'll say a kind of an over-negation of um, the world, and a kind of like a hyper, I would say like a hyper mokshic kind of rejection of the world and of creation as Krishna's energy.
Beautiful, great. So, what's the most surprising thing you have learned from devotees outside the Gaudiya tradition?
Similar answer to the last point. I've been really moved by the way I've heard devotees in the Pushti Marg tradition of Sripad Vallabhacharya
This is
talk
something
about.
I have been reading recently. So,
Oh yeah, beautiful. But this idea again, kind of relating to the previous question of a paradigm of Shuddha Dvaita, of a kind of a bhakti infused non-dualism rooted in love, and just seeing Krishna everywhere in everything in a way that doesn't reduce things to impersonalism, but like heightens personalism.
beautiful. If someone says, I don't need a guru, I just follow my Chaitya guru, what's your one sentence response?
Continue to follow your Chaitya guru, and be aware that many very wise, thoughtful people who are connected to their Chaitya guru also found a lot of value in having a personal relationship interaction with a living human guru.
Thank you. A few more and I'll leave you take rest.
No, I feel like I'm not doing a good job of making them hot and spicy. So maybe I should try to be a little bit more provocative. I don't know.
It's fine. No, it's fine. They're not that hot either. What's one cultural aspect of Vaishnavism or Indian Vaishnavism, if you want to use that term, that you think don't translate well in the West?
I think anything that is explicitly or even implicitly sort of related to caste.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have, it requires a lot of nuance and a lot of time to unpack the way that we engage or have engaged historically with caste. But I think especially these days, there's so much, understandably in some ways, there's so much sensitivity around, and it's such a dynamite, hot topic, fraught kind of thing that I think a lot of times we'd be better off just not engaging with it at all. I sometimes cringe when I hear like some references, even very with good intention, but I'll say something about da 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 and worshiping the Brahmanas, and I'm just like, if some of like if some students I know on the campus that I work, if they were to hear that, they would just be horrified and be like, this is casteism run amok or whatever. So I think we could do without that right now.
Okay, we don't want the campus being burned. So let's take care of that one. So what's a question you think every Gaudiya Vaishnav should be asking but isn't?
Asking who?
Asking themselves.
I think every Gaudiya Vaishnav should be asking themselves, how much of a personal relationship do I feel like I am cultivating with Krishna right now?
The last one. If you had 30 seconds, as you will have for sure, to explain what Gaudiya Vaishnavism, why Gaudiya Vaishnavism matters in 2025, what will you say?
That's really putting me on the spot. I think I would say something to the effect. Well, first of all, I want to push back on the prompt, because so much of what I would say would depend on the context and depend on who I'm saying it to. And I'm a firm believer in, to the best of my ability, being present to the person in front of me and what I feel like Krishna is inspiring and directing me to connect with them about in that moment.
So I'm
particularly if
I'm the person in front of you right now. So I'm the one asking you, why Gaudiya Vaishnavism matters in 2025? What will you reply to Swami Padmanabha?
Well, I would say, Swamiji, I would love to hear your answer, first of all, and learn from your answer, because you're such a wellspring of wisdom. But also, since you're asking, in my take on it is, I think Gaudiya Vaishnavism offers an amazing, even a radical, to use a word that you like to use, a radical approach to synthesizing a Vedanta of divinity that is all pervasive, that is radically immanent, but also that is transcendent, that is personal, that is relational. And Gaudiya Vaishnavism gives us not just a clear theology of how to do that, but practical tools for how to live in that beautiful liminal hybrid space of the transcendent, the immanent, and ultimately the relational.
Congratulations, Venkata Bhatta, you have survived the hot, spicy menu.
Whew!
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That was much more philosophical than I thought you'd get into hot button stuff, like in terms of topical.
That's for you and Namarasa and your own podcast. I don't want to compete with that. I have my own way of being hot. So, Venkataji, to conclude, just to wrap up, if you could leave our listeners with one key takeaway, whether a challenge, an insight, an inspiration, what will that be?
Oh gosh, I would love to. Well, now just reflecting on this this awesome conversation we've had about discovering and rediscovering and choosing, and choosing every day, and the initiation every day. Maybe a little playful challenge or takeaway I'd like to leave listeners and viewers with is just, if nothing else, but as a thought experiment, maybe to approach tomorrow, to approach the coming week, the coming month, coming next couple of months, year, or whatever, in this spirit of like, how am I going to open myself up to be initiated by life today, in this moment, again and again? How am I going to choose or open myself up to that choice to be initiated, to take that step? I think that's a pretty neat takeaway. I'm going to certainly reflect on that and try to work that into my own kind of way of being for a little while now. So, yeah.
I'll subscribe to that one, Venkataji. Actually, that reminds me, if I may share with you a series of similar points that I read recently from from one Christian saint called Sister Macrina Whitaker, a contemporary, and she suggests a series of questions for a daily, like, exam of consciousness. So she says, and I leave them quickly, of course, so much to elaborate here. First is, on a daily basis, to ask ourselves, right? So, have the ears of my heart opened to the voice of God? Have the ears of my heart open to the needs of my sisters and brothers? Have the ears of my heart beheld the divine face in all created things? What do I know but live as though I do not know? Is there anyone, including myself, whom I need to forgive? On a daily basis, right? When did I experience my heart opening wide today? And the last one says, what is the one thing in my life that is standing on tiptoe crying, may I have your attention, please? Anyhow, in complement to the invitation you shared, so we are giving our audience lots of homework to do. So thank you so much.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you. Can you please send me that? Would you mind sending that over?
I will for sure. Whomever wants me to send that, you can communicate with me privately as well. Deep gratitude, dear Venkata. Thank you so much for joining us in conversation, our Free Radical podcast, and looking forward to continue exploring together on a daily basis, continue being initiated on a daily basis, and meeting again soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And, at the risk of kind of performative humility, let me just honestly say that, and I really do mean this, if anything I've said, is hurtful to anyone, is seen as inappropriate, is seen as, offensive or thoughtless in some way, please know that although I take responsibility for it, it's that's not on you, that's on me. I please also know that it's entirely inadvertent. And if there is something good, inspiring, energizing, nourishing that came from this, I'm very happy. And please also know that it is a product of a lot of love and wisdom and gifts that have been poured into me and given to me, often when I've least deserved them, but most gratefully accepted them. So just please know that if there's something of value, that it's not from me alone, and it's something that I must credit a number of teachers and mentors and friends with.
Thank you for the clarification and the reminder that we are all part of a bigger gift that we are being bestowed upon. So thank you for being that gift for all of us today. See you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj. Hare Krishna, Radhe Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe.